I'm Marjorie Bennett. I'm 74 now, and the home I've lived in for over 40 years still smells faintly of lemon oil and old books. This morning, I woke up alone again in my upstairs bedroom. Sunlight streaming across the faded blue quilt. Farley's picture still perched on my nightstand. I pulled on my worn robe and listened to the sound of dishes clinking somewhere below. My son's voice drifted up from the kitchen, too early for visitors, and too late for the peace I used to find in that first cup of tea. By the end of that day, the house would feel smaller than ever before. I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like and subscribe button if you've ever had to stand your ground when it mattered most. The house on Walnut Avenue was never supposed to feel this way. It was built in the late 1890s, a wide porch stained glass over the front door, oak floors that creaked, no matter how careful you stepped after Farley passed away. I tried to keep everything just as it was. He and I raised our son that way, with the old Southern values. My own mother believed in kindness to strangers, respect for the past, doing what needs to be done without making a fuss. After Farley's funeral, neighbors brought casseroles and sympathy, but evenings felt so quiet you could almost hear time moving when my son Thomas called and asked if he and his wife might stay, just for a few weeks. I didn't hesitate. I'd helped them buy their apartment in the city when they first married, and Thomas had always been my world, curious, restless, drawn to new things. He married Helen 5 years back, a woman who wore bright lipstick and expensive shoes, who liked her coffee strong and her conversation sharper. At first, I was grateful for their company. Their laughter echoed through rooms that had grown still after Farley was gone, and for a while, the place felt full again, but slowly things began to change. Helen started packing away my old china, just until we needed again. And new white dishes appeared on the table. My collection of antique books disappeared from the living room shelves, replaced by glossy magazines and glass vases. Thomas said it was all part of helping the house feel modern every day. There was something a little different. A favorite chair moved, family photos tucked away in a drawer. Helen always said it was for my own good. But sometimes I hardly recognized the rooms around me. I tried not to say anything, tried to be gracious to guests when Helen's friends filled my house for dinners. I never planned. I watched her laugh from the head of the table, the place that used to be mine, and caught Thomas's eyes as he stared down at his phone. The stories I'd once shared about Farley or our travels seemed to get interrupted more and more often. The house felt crowded, but I never felt more alone. One Sunday, Thomas suggested a family lunch, just the three of us, like old times, he said with a smile I hadn't seen since he was a boy. I dressed in my favorite blue dress, the one Farley brought back from New Orleans for our 30th anniversary, and went downstairs, hoping things might feel right again. As I walked into the living room, I caught a glimpse of Helen's eyes on my dress. Her lips pressed together in a way that made it hard to tell if she was smiling or not. The table was set with new china. The walls felt closer than ever, and I realized that somewhere along the way, I'd stopped recognizing the place I called home. Helen's eyes lingered on my dress for a second longer, but she didn't say anything at first. Thomas poured the wine, one of the good bottles from the cellar, the kind we used to save for holidays, and the three of us sat in that small living room with the curtains drawn and the new china gleaming under the overhead light. I noticed Doris had brought out my favorite asparagus soup just the way I liked it, but Helen only took a small spoonful and set her bowl aside. Thomas started talking about his work about the renovation project at his firm, his voice lighter than I'd heard in weeks. For a moment, it almost felt like family again, the way it used to be before everything got so tangled up. But Helen's smile never quite reached her eyes. She interrupted now and then, glancing at the drapes or the wallpaper, making little comments about how a brighter color might lift the mood, or how people aren't really using heavy curtains these days. I didn't answer, just kept my hands folded in my lap. Doris brought out the roast duck, one of my oldest recipes, and Thomas said it tasted like his childhood. That made me smile. Then Helen reached for the serving platter and asked if next time I might consider something a little lighter. You know, Marjorie Duck is a bit rich for a Sunday lunch. She wasn't unkind, but there was a tone behind it, the same one I'd started to notice more often lately. After the meal, Doris served the tea. I saw her hands tremble as she poured the after effects of a stubborn summer cold. I offered to take the kettle, wanting to spare her the strain, but as I leaned forward, the kettle shifted, and hot tea sloshed over the rim. It landed right in Helen's lap, darkening the fabric of her cream dress. She shot to her feet, gasping, her voice louder than I'd ever heard it. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Marjorie, that's my new dress." I stood, napkin in hand, apologizing, but she brushed me away, her cheeks flushed. "You never liked my taste, did you? Always so particular about your things, your house, your way of doing everything." Thomas stepped between us, his hands up, asking everyone to calm down. "It was an accident," he said, trying to laugh it off, but Helen wasn't having it. "Accident. This is just one more way your mother makes it impossible for me to feel at home here." I watched Thomas's face, searching for a sign he would stand by me, but instead, he just shook his head and told us both to take a breath. I could feel my own hands shaking, but not from the tea. Something else was shifting inside me, something slow and heavy, like the feeling you get right before a storm. Helen went on, saying how she'd tried to help, how she'd worked to make the house comfortable for everyone. She waved around the room, her voice rising. "Everything here is stuck in the past. You can't move forward if you're always clinging to what's gone." I told her quietly, but clearly, that this was my home. I'd built a life here, and everything in it meant something to me. She crossed her arms and said that soon enough the house would be theirs, and the first thing she'd do was clear out all this clutter. My heart felt squeezed tight, but I didn't let it show. Thomas tried again to make peace, but his words sounded tired, almost like he was pleading with a child. "Mom, let's just not fight about this. Helen's trying, and you take everything as an attack." I asked him what else I was supposed to feel after the past few months. I reminded him that I'd heard their late-night talks about how the house was too much for me and other options for my future. He looked away, jaw clenched. Helen stared at me with that same cold, fixed smile. When Helen said the words over my dead body, I felt a chill. There wasn't a trace of kindness left in her voice, just calculation. I told them both as calm as I could manage that if they couldn't respect my home, maybe it was time to reconsider the arrangement. Helen accused me of paranoia. Thomas tried to smooth things over, saying everyone was just tired and upset, that maybe we could talk again in the morning. I told him no, not this time. I said I wanted them both to pack their things and leave. Helen's voice got shrill. "You can't be serious." Thomas put his head in his hands. "Mom, the renovations on our apartment." I stopped him. 6 months of renovations is long enough for anyone. I looked at them both and said, "If you don't leave, I'll change my will." That got their attention. Helen's expression went tight, and for a split second, I saw something like fear flicker in Thomas's eyes. I turned to leave the room. "Where are you going?" Thomas called after me. "To call my attorney," I said over my shoulder. Orion had handled our family's legal matters for years. He was the only one who'd never treated me as anything less than an equal. I made my way up the stairs, my legs unsteady, and closed the door behind me, pressing my palm to my cheek where Helen's slap still burned. The house settled into silence, broken only by muffled voices downstairs and the ticking of the old clock in the hall. I stared out the window, watching a line of sunlight creep across the neighbor's lawn. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel fear. I felt something closer to certainty. I pulled out the photo album from my nightstand, flipping through pictures of Farley and me in our younger days, wedding snapshots, vacations, Thomas as a boy with a gap-toothed smile, all the birthdays and holidays, and everyday moments we'd lived in this house. I stayed up that night, listening to the creak of the floors, The hush of wind through the trees, the city sounds drifting in through the old glass. I remembered what it felt like when Farley was alive, when the house rang with laughter and purpose. I thought about the day we brought Thomas home from the hospital, the smell of baby powder and fresh paint, the feeling that anything was possible. In the quiet hours before dawn, the path ahead of me felt clearer than it had in a long time. I knew what I had to do. Downstairs, the kitchen light flickered on, and I could hear Doris moving quietly, starting a new day. I reached for the phone and dialed Orion's number, steadying my voice as I spoke. He would come in the morning, he promised. Don't make any decisions in haste, he advised, but I'd already made up my mind. Outside, the sky was turning pale and streaked with pink, the kind of morning that always made Farley whistle as he set out the birdseed. I stood at the window a little longer, watching the sun come up over Walnut Avenue, and waited for the day to begin, knowing everything in this house was about to change. That morning, I moved through the house on Walnut Avenue as quietly as I could, listening for any sound from upstairs. Doris greeted me in the kitchen with her gentle smile, setting down a fresh cup of tea at the table, without a word about the noise or the voices from the night before. She placed a plate of toast and jam beside me, her movements slow, careful, as if she knew I needed time to gather myself before facing anything else. For a while, I just sat there, hands wrapped around the warm mug, letting the steam ease the ache in my chest. The clock over the stove ticked off the minutes, and every now and then I could hear the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing by on the street. The house was still, but I felt every memory pressing in on me from the walls. The hours slipped by, each one slower than the last. Doris returned to tidy the counters, humming under her breath, and when I thanked her for the tea, she simply patted my hand and told me to call if I needed anything else. I took my tea into the small sitting room off the entryway, curling up in the old armchair Farley had favored, and looked out at the overgrown garden. The roses he'd planted along the fence were blooming again, just as they always had, no matter how many seasons passed. I let my eyes wander over the familiar shapes of the furniture, the old clock on the mantel, the faded photographs in silver frames, and for a moment I could almost imagine Farley's footsteps on the porch. After lunch, the silence in the house felt heavier than before. I found myself walking through the rooms, tracing my fingers along the spines of books, straightening a picture frame, picking up a piece of pottery, and setting it back down. It was as if every object was waiting for someone to remember its story. Upstairs, Thomas and Helen kept to themselves, the muffled sound of their voices barely carrying down the hall. I knew Doris would bring me news if they left the house, but for now, I just drifted from one room to the next, searching for some sign that things would be all right again. As the afternoon wore on, I sat down at the desk in my office, opened the top drawer, and pulled out the stack of old photographs I'd tucked away. There were pictures of Thomas as a child, Farley, at a barbecue, my own parents standing in front of a Chevy with grins so wide they looked like kids themselves. I thumbed through each one, letting the images take me back to summers at the lake, birthday cakes with too many candles, Christmas mornings before anyone had learned to be disappointed. It was all there, pressed between glossy pieces of paper, and the memories that never seemed to fade. Sometime after 4, Doris knocked softly on the office door and stepped inside. "You all right, Mrs. Bennett?" she asked, her voice low, careful. I nodded, not trusting myself to say much more. She handed me another cup of tea and left the door open behind her. I sat there a while longer, turning the ring on my finger, listening to the house breathe around me. Outside, the wind rattled the windows and a branch tapped gently against the glass. Dinner that evening was quiet, just me and Doris at the table. She served up a simple meal, chicken and rice, green beans from the garden, a peach cobbler she'd made that morning. We ate in companionable silence, and when she cleared the plates, she glanced at me and said, Sometimes folks just need time to see what's right in front of them. I didn't answer, but her words settled over me like a quilt, heavy and warm. Night fell, and the house grew dark, except for the soft pool of light from my bedroom lamp. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to Thomas and Helen's footsteps overhead. The muted sound of water running the opening and closing of drawers. I wondered how long they would stay, how many more days the house would be filled with voices that seemed to echo off empty walls. In the darkness, I let my thoughts wander to the years before, when Thomas was small and came running to me for comfort, when Farley would come home with arms full of groceries and stories from the office, when laughter filled the kitchen, and I felt like I belonged right where I was. It was a long night. I watched the numbers on the alarm clock inch forward, heard a dog bark in the distance, and waited for the gray dawn to slide through the curtains. In those hours, I thought about all the little ways I'd tried to keep my family close, every late-night phone call, every check sent for birthdays or car repairs, every meal made from scratch when Thomas said he was coming home. I wondered when it had changed, when giving had become so much easier than asking for anything in return. The next day, I woke before sunrise, the house still silent, except for the steady hum of the air conditioning. I moved through my morning routine, brushing my hair, straightening the sheets, watering the violets on the windowsill, clinging to the comfort of old habits. I didn't see Thomas or Helen until mid-morning, when Helen passed me on the stairs, her eyes sliding away from mine. She disappeared into the guest room, and a moment later, I heard the door close with a soft click. It was almost noon when Thomas knocked on the door to my office. He lingered in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking everywhere but at me. "Helen's not feeling well," he said. "We'll probably be keeping to ourselves today." I nodded and told him Doris would bring them lunch if they wanted. He thanked me, his voice thin, and left without another word. I spent the afternoon tending to the garden. The soil was warm, and the scent of honeysuckle drifted on the breeze. I knelt in the dirt, pulling weeds, trimming back the roses, remembering the way Farley would whistle while he worked the sun on his neck, sweat darkening his shirt. The simple rhythm of it all helped quiet my mind, and for a little while, I felt almost myself again. As evening came, I sat out on the porch with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sky fade from blue to gold, and finally to that deep indigo shade that always reminded me of summers long past. I could see the light in the upstairs window, the shadows of Thomas and Helen moving behind the curtain. I didn't know what they were thinking, what their next move might be, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a small sense of peace settle over me. Inside, I found Doris in the kitchen, packing away leftovers and wiping down the counters. She caught my eye and smiled, and I realized I wasn't as alone as I'd feared. The house might have felt too big, too quiet, too full of echoes, but there were still good hearts under its roof. I said goodnight to Doris and climbed the stairs to my room, moving slowly, listening to the floorboards creak beneath my feet. Lying in bed that night, I stared up at the ceiling and let my mind drift. I didn't try to solve anything, didn't try to change the past or rush what was coming. I just let the silence be what it was, a soft space to rest in a pause before the next morning. Tomorrow, I knew would bring its own challenges, but for now, I could hold on to the quiet, the memories, and the simple truth that I was still here. I woke before the sun had finished rising, the pale light slipping across the floor like water. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the hall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. I moved slowly, smoothing the edge of the bedspread, brushing my hair back into its clip, buttoning the dark green cardigan I always reached for when I needed to feel composed. I opened the window just enough to let in the sound of the birds and stood there for a moment, letting the morning air touch my face. Downstairs, Doris was already at work, the scent of coffee and buttered toast drifting into the hallway. She gave me a quiet nod when I walked in and poured me a cup without asking. We sat together at the kitchen table the way we used to in the months after Farley passed. She didn't ask questions, didn't press for details, just sat with me in the calm that comes when two people understand something without needing to explain it. By mid-morning, I had changed into slacks and a blouse ready for the visit. Orion had said he'd arrive around 11. I set the front room in order, straightening the stack of catalogs on the table, drawing the curtains open to let the light fall just right across the wood floors. The antique clock on the mantel struck once then again. Each chime seemed to settle deeper in my chest than the last. The doorbell rang right on time. Doris opened it, and Orion stepped inside with that same old leather briefcase and steady way of walking I'd known for years. He hadn't changed much, still tall, still deliberate in his movements, still carrying himself like a man who knew how to hold silence. We moved to the study where he took a seat across from me and opened his notebook. He listened carefully as I explained what had happened, what had built up over months, what had spilled over just 2 days ago. I told him about the tea, the raised voices, the silence that followed, about Thomas's quiet retreat and Helen's pointed threats. Orion didn't interrupt. He took notes, slowly pen scratching across the paper. When I finished, he folded his hands and waited a moment before speaking. "I'll need specifics," he said gently. "What you want to leave, where you want it to go." I nodded. We began with the house. I told him I wanted it turned over to the city, preserved as a museum if possible. "Everything as it is," I said. "The furniture, the collections, the woodwork. I want people to see what care and history look like when they're kept intact." He asked about the antiques, and I told him they should go to Adeline Crane. "She knows how to care for them," I said, "and she understands what they mean." He nodded again, jotting the name down. Then came the money. I hesitated, the words slower coming than before. "I don't want to cut Thomas out entirely," I said, "but I want the rest to go towards something lasting. A scholarship, for art students, for young people who see the world with care." Orion looked up. "And for your son?" I told him I'd leave an allowance, modest but regular, enough to live on, if not lavishly. "With one condition," I added. "They're not to set foot in this house again. Not while I'm alive. Not after." Orion didn't speak right away. When he did, he asked if I understood what that meant, not just legally, but in every other way. I said I did. We spent another half hour going over details, legal phrasing, dates, storage for the documents. I told him I wanted the will read aloud. "Here," I said, "in this room. I want them to hear every word." Orion looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "I'll have the papers ready tomorrow morning." After he left, I stayed in the office a little longer, looking out the window. A breeze lifted the curtain, and I watched as the sunlight danced across the edge of the rug. I thought about Farley. I could almost hear his voice, low and steady, the way he used to talk when the news came on. I could see him standing by that window, hands in his pockets, looking out over the same street. I stayed there until I heard the front door open again. Adeline arrived a little after 2. Her knock was light, and when Doris showed her in, she walked into the room with a smile that reached her eyes. "I brought those books on lacquerware," she said, holding up a small stack bound in soft cloth covers. I motioned for her to sit with me in the conservatory. The air in there was warm and full of light, the windows fogged slightly from the early afternoon humidity. We sat among the plants, the glass shelves, the soft rustle of leaves. She noticed something was off before I said anything. Her smile faded, and she leaned in a little. "Is everything all right?" I nodded, but it took a moment before I could answer. I told her what had happened over lunch 2 days ago. I told her what I'd decided. When I mentioned the will, her name, the museum, the antiques, she looked down at her hands, then back up at me. Why, she asked. Why me? I told her the truth. Because she saw beauty in old things. Because she handled every piece with care. Because she reminded me of someone I'd once been, and someone I was glad still existed in the world. She didn't speak right away, just nodded her fingers, tightening briefly around her teacup. I didn't expect gratitude, and she didn't offer it. What she did offer was something quieter, presence, steadiness, a kind of respect that didn't need to be spoken. We sat in the conservatory until the light shifted and the walls turned golden. She promised to return the next day for the reading. I thanked her. After she left, I stood alone in the hallway, hand resting on the railing of the staircase. The house felt still again, but not empty. There was something in the quiet now that felt different, like it was holding its breath with me. That night, I went through the old auction records I kept filed in the desk drawers. Catalogs I'd helped curate, essays I'd written. I laid them out one by one, remembering the places they came from, the people I'd met along the way. I thought about all the pieces I'd restored, studied, passed along to collectors who cared enough to preserve them. It wasn't just about the things, it was about the stories they held, the hands they'd passed through, the time they'd carried forward. Doris brought me tea before bed. She asked if I wanted anything else. I told her no. She hesitated before leaving her hand on the doorknob. "Tomorrow will be a big day," she said. I nodded, and she gave me a quiet smile before stepping out into the hall. The house creaked, as it always did at night, pipes settling wood, shifting wind slipping through the old eaves. I lay there in bed, watching the shadows move across the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the walls around me. Tomorrow, they'd sit across from me just a few feet away, but the distance between us would be miles wide. And for the first time, I felt ready to close that space, not with words, not with explanation, but with something stronger. The morning of the will reading began the way most days do in that house, quietly. Doris was already in the kitchen when I came down, soft clinks and hums trailing behind her as she moved between cupboards. She handed me a cup of coffee, without a word, her eyes steady, and I gave her a small nod. Outside, the sky was pale, overcast, the kind of weather that makes everything feel like it's holding its breath. I wore a dark skirt and a pressed blouse with pearl buttons. Nothing flashy, just neat and proper. I spent some time in the conservatory while I waited the warm air and filtered light, calming my nerves more than anything else could. The roses had opened just a little more overnight. Their petals curled gently at the edges, like they were tired too. A little before 10, I heard a car pull up the drive. The tires crunched over the gravel, slow and deliberate. Doris met them at the door. Thomas and Helen, dressed too formally for a visit but too casually for a funeral. Thomas gave me a tight nod when he walked in. Helen didn't meet my eyes at all. Orion arrived not long after. He stepped into the house carrying his leather briefcase, his coat draped over one arm. He moved like he always did, without hurry, without apology. He gave a polite greeting to Thomas and Helen, then turned to me with a nod. "Are we ready?" he asked. I said yes. We gathered in the front parlor. The room still held the late morning chill, though Doris had lit the gas fire earlier to take the edge off. Thomas sat stiffly on the edge of the floral couch. Helen chose the armchair near the window, folding one leg over the other, with a sharpness that didn't match the softness of the cushions. I stayed standing for a moment longer than I needed to, then sat down across from them in the second armchair, my hands resting on my knees. Orion remained standing as he opened his briefcase, removed a folder, and took out the will. His voice, when he began, was calm, unhurried. This document, he said, reflects the final wishes of Margaret Halbrook regarding her estate property and personal holdings. He paused, eyes scanning the page, then looked up. She has requested that this will be read aloud in full. Thomas adjusted his collar. Helen exhaled through her nose. I didn't move. He read slowly, line by line. The house, as specified, was to be donated to the city's historical trust. Every antique, every piece of the collection was to remain in place, preserved, catalogued, and opened eventually to the public as a museum in memory of Farley Halbrook's legacy. I watched Thomas's face as the words sank in. He blinked once, then looked down at his shoes. The antique furniture and decorative arts, many of which Helen had once called clutter, were to be overseen and maintained by Adeline Crane, whose name was clearly stated in the legal documents. Helen looked up at that. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. She glanced at Thomas, but he didn't return her look. Then came the trust. The financial assets, the remainder of the estate, after debts and transfers, were to be divided in two. One half would fund a scholarship foundation established in the Halbrook name for young artists studying preservation-conservation or historical curation. The other half would form a modest monthly allowance directed to Thomas Halbrook, contingent on one clause: Mr. Halbrook and any of his immediate household are to permanently vacate the property and not return. The silence after that line stretched long. Orion closed the folder gently. Those are the terms, he said. All legal paperwork has been prepared and notarized. These decisions are final. Thomas stood up too fast, the back of his knees catching on the couch cushion. He looked at me, then really looked, his brow creased, mouth slightly open. You're giving the house to the city, he asked, the words almost breathless. And a stranger is in charge of everything. I didn't respond. I sat there steady. Helen's voice came sharp and clipped from across the room. So this was your plan, she said. Play hostess, let us settle in then, throw us out like tenants. She rose, gathering her bag. You've made your point. Thomas didn't move right away. He looked around the room, eyes darting to the windows, the fire, the mantel where the clock ticked on, as if none of it mattered. Finally, he turned to Orion. Is there any room to dispute this? Orion shook his head. Mrs. Halbrook's wishes are fully protected under law. I've ensured the process is binding. Thomas gave a short nod like he'd expected that answer, but had to ask anyway. He turned back to me. All right, he said, if that's what you want. I walked them to the front door. Helen didn't look back. Thomas paused at the threshold, one hand on the knob. You didn't have to do it this way, he said. I met his gaze, said nothing. He stepped outside. I stood in the doorway for a moment after they'd gone, looking out at the driveway as their car pulled away. Doris stepped up behind me with a folded sweater in her hands. They've packed up, she said. They won't be staying another night. I nodded and closed the door. Later that afternoon, I met with Adeline. She arrived just after 3, wearing that soft gray coat she favored and carrying a small notebook. We walked through the house together, room by room. I pointed out pieces I thought needed special care: the carved credenza in the back hallway, the tapestry in the music room that always pulled a little to the left. She took notes, asked questions, ran her fingers gently over the surfaces the way she always had, with attention, not possession. We paused in the dining room, and she looked around for a long while. It's beautiful, she said. Even without them. I nodded. She turned to me. Are you all right? I told her I would be. The house felt different already, like it had taken a deep breath. That night, I sat in the conservatory alone. The last of the daylight caught on the glass, casting soft gold across the tiled floor. I listened to the wind rustling the trees and the distant hum of a neighbor's lawnmower. The house was quiet again, not empty, but settled. As if it knew the worst had passed. In the corner of the room sat an old box filled with Farley's journals, still tied with the same green ribbon he'd used years ago. I reached for it and untied the bow. The ribbon came undone, easily frayed at the edges from age. Inside the box, Farley's handwriting filled every page, blue ink, small and precise, the way he always wrote when he was thinking through something. I carried the first journal to the chair by the window and began reading. He wrote about the house, about the weight of its history and the joy he felt preserving it. Pages filled with observations on lighting wood grain, how different parts of the house sounded during each season. He'd written about Doris, too. How she'd noticed a leak in the solarium roof before the contractors ever caught it. How she moved through the rooms like she belonged to them, or maybe they belonged to her. Then I found an entry dated shortly after Thomas and Helen had moved in. She's rearranging everything. Margaret pretends not to notice, but I can see the hurt behind her eyes. The rooms are quieter when she leaves them now. That woman doesn't want to live here. She wants to take the house and turn it into something it's not. I stopped reading for a moment. The air in the conservatory had gone still. I flipped through more pages, fingers brushing over dates that marked anniversaries, birthdays, and simple mornings where Farley had sat in that very chair recording the rhythm of our days. It wasn't until the third journal that I found the letter, folded neatly between two pages, sealed in a plain envelope with my name written across the front in his handwriting. Not Marge, like he used to call me in person. Not Honey. Just Margaret. I didn't open it right away. I laid it in my lap and looked out at the garden, the early spring buds pushing through the soil, the climbing ivy already beginning to reach. Then slowly, I broke the seal. The letter was dated 6 months before Farley passed. Margaret, if you're reading this, then you've already made the decision I suspected you'd have to make. And I want to say right now, you were right to do it. The house needs someone who understands what it stands for, not someone trying to turn it into a magazine page. I didn't say much when Thomas and Helen started changing things because I didn't want to put more weight on your shoulders. But I saw it. All of it. I saw how hard you tried to stay gracious, how you kept finding ways to make room for them, even when they made less room for you. I want you to know, none of this is your fault. Some people inherit history. Others try to erase it. I've set things in place in case you need help. Talk to Orion. He knows everything. And don't forget Doris. She's always known how to read a room better than either of us. You're not alone. I read it again, then a third time. When I finally folded it back up, I felt the shift, not sudden, not dramatic, but a slow settling. Like the house itself had exhaled. Like something that had been stuck for years had finally loosened. The next morning, I called Orion and asked to meet at the bank. We went over the trust documents again, and I asked for one small change. I wanted to set aside a portion of the funds quietly to support the long-term upkeep of the house once it became public. Not just the building, but the stories inside it. Farley's journals, my records, Doris's collection of old blueprints she'd kept tucked in a filing box since the 1980s. Things that wouldn't be in the official inventory, but told the truth all the same. Later that week, Adeline brought over her assistant, a young man named Jacob. He reminded me of Thomas when he was in his 20s, eager, curious, full of questions. But unlike Thomas, he listened. As I walked them through the house again this time, I brought out the smaller details, the carvings hidden in the attic railing, the initials in the pantry floorboard from the original builder's daughter. I showed them the guest registry Farley had kept during every historical society tour, each name dated and numbered in his careful script. They took it all in. A few days after that, Doris came into the conservatory while I was polishing the side table near the French doors. She had a folded newspaper in her hand. "You've been mentioned," she said. She handed me the article. The headline read, "Local Widow Donates Landmark Home to City Preserves Hidden Legacy." The piece was brief, but kind. It mentioned the donation, the trust, the intention to preserve the site for educational use. There was even a photo one taken years ago, back when Farley and I had hosted the anniversary garden party for the historical board. I wore a yellow dress in that picture. Farley had on suspenders. We were both laughing. I clipped the article and tucked it into the back of one of the journals. That weekend, I sat down and began labeling each entry with a small note about the day it was written. I added some of my own memories in the margins. Where we were when that thunderstorm knocked out power in '92. What we served at the luncheon for the mayor's wife. Which rug Thomas spilled ink on when he was 6 and tried to hide it under a houseplant. The past wasn't something I wanted to keep locked up anymore. It had to breathe. It had to be handed forward the way Farley always meant it to be. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the upstairs hallway outside the room Thomas and Helen used to stay in. The door was closed now. The sheets had been stripped, the drawers empty. But as I sat there, I remembered a different moment Thomas, at 8 years old, standing barefoot in that hallway, holding a flashlight and a book, asking if he could sleep in our room, because the wind sounded like whispers. There were pieces of him still here, pieces that hadn't vanished even if the man had. Downstairs, I heard the front door open, Adeline's voice warm and clear, calling my name. I stood slowly and walked down to meet her, the sound of my steps echoing gently through the hallway that at long last felt like mine again. The invitation arrived, folded in heavy cardstock gold script, spelling out "Celebrating the launch of the Whitmore Harlan Design Institute." Helen's name was printed beneath Thomas's, with a decorative flourish that curved just enough to make it feel showy. The return address was their new office suite downtown, 2 floors, custom interior, Helen's dream realized in glass and polished marble. I left it unopened on the sideboard for 3 days before finally reading the rest. In the corner, a small line read, "Cocktail attire. Guests strictly by list." On the morning of the event, I made tea and set it on the porch beside Farley's chair. The wind had picked up overnight leaves skittering along the walk. I watched a squirrel dart across the yard, remembering how Thomas used to chase them with a plastic sword, convinced they were spies for a hidden kingdom in the elm trees. By early afternoon, I knew I would go. Adeline offered to drive, and I accepted. She arrived in a navy blue sedan, hair tucked into a loose twist. A soft green shawl draped across her shoulders. As we pulled away from the house, I looked back once. The curtains in the front parlor stirred slightly. It felt less like leaving and more like taking something with me. The venue was a renovated textile mill, steel beams, exposed brick, an enormous skylight overhead that cast the whole space in warm gold light. Inside, a trio played soft jazz, and servers moved between guests with trays of champagne and cucumber canapes. Most of the people there looked like Helen's crowd: sharp collars, expensive shoes, small talk polished to a sheen. Thomas stood near the center of the room, hands in his pockets, smiling politely at a group of investors. When he saw me, something flickered across his face, not quite surprise, not quite welcome. Helen reached him first. She leaned in, her voice pitched low but tight. "You came," she said. "I did." Adeline drifted toward a woman from the preservation board, leaving me to stand just behind the crowd gathering around Thomas. He gestured toward a projection of floor plans and architectural renderings on the far wall. "And here, we'll integrate the original molding into a gallery-style corridor. Full climate control, clean lines, everything adaptable for modern use." He paused. "We're calling it the Whitmore House Initiative." Someone clapped. Another asked about tax credits. Helen stepped forward with a champagne flute in hand. For those of you unfamiliar, she said the Whitmore house was in the family for generations. A lovely old thing full of charm and desperately in need of modernization. Thankfully, we've worked something out. A man in a silver tie leaned closer. Wasn't there some talk of landmark status? Helen's smile didn't falter. Only talk. My fingers curled around the strap of my handbag. Across the room, Adeline met my eye, then nodded slightly. That was the moment I stepped forward. Actually, I said it was more than talk. The small group shifted. Thomas turned brow furrowed. The Whitmore house was officially granted protected landmark status 3 weeks ago, I continued. It will be open to the public later this year. As a museum. Helen's glass froze midair. It's been donated to the Historical Trust, I added. Endowment secured, and the name on the records will remain unchanged. Thomas's mouth opened then closed again. Around us, conversation slowed. I turned slightly to the man with the silver tie. You asked about preservation. The original woodwork stained glass journals, everything will be kept in place. Not integrated, not repurposed, preserved. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Helen set her glass down hard on a nearby tray. You don't have the authority, I do, I said quietly. Farley made sure of that. And Thomas signed off on the transfer when he assumed I wouldn't act on it. The color drained from her face. I'm sure you'll find another building, I added. One that hasn't already been promised to memory. Behind me, I heard Adeline say something to the preservation board, contact something about press releases and new signage. I stepped back into the crowd. People were watching now, but no one said much. A few nodded. One man touched my elbow gently as I passed. Outside, the light had changed. The wind had died down. In the car, Adeline drove in silence for a moment. Then quietly. That was something. I looked down at my lap, the soft fabric of my skirt, the wedding ring still resting on my hand. It was necessary. She turned the corner onto Whitmore Avenue. Ahead, the house waited still tall, unshaken. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw someone waiting at the gate. A young woman with a notepad and a camera slung across her shoulder. As I stepped out, she approached. Mrs. Bennett. I nodded. I'm from the City Register, she said. I heard you're opening the house. I'd love to hear the story behind it. I glanced up at the house, then back at her. Come by Tuesday, I said. I'll have tea ready. The young reporter came by that Tuesday afternoon, just like she said. She wore a denim jacket over a pale blouse and carried a little recorder she placed on the table between us. I served tea in my grandmother's china, the white porcelain cups with the tiny violets curling along the rim. We sat on the back porch, where the light filtered through the trees and the wind carried the faint scent of lilacs. She asked about the house, about my father, about the decision to turn it into a museum. I told her what needed to be told and nothing more. I didn't speak about Helen's face at the launch party, or how Thomas couldn't meet my eyes when he passed me in the parking lot. I didn't talk about how the silence in my house had changed less like something missing and more like something at peace. I told the girl about Farley's woodworking, the journals he left behind, the notes in the margins of floor plans no one had looked at in decades. I showed her the pantry with the old flour scale, the worn banister polished by 100 years of hands. I watched her take it all in, wide-eyed and quiet. She was young. She hadn't learned yet how rare it is for something to be kept whole. When she left, I walked the garden path alone. The rosemary had grown thick near the porch steps. My knees didn't like the bending, but I knelt anyway, snipped a few sprigs, and held them up to my face. It smelled like Sunday dinners and spring mornings, and the one time my mother braided it into my hair before a recital. That's what this house carried, things too small for ledgers or press releases. Things that don't appear in contracts, but linger in the walls. A week later, a small article appeared in the local section of the paper. The Whitmore House, One Woman's Quiet Preservation. Just beneath the headline was a photograph of me standing in front of the oak doors, hand resting lightly on the brass handle. No drama, no scandal. Just a name, a place, and a purpose returned to itself. Helen sent a letter the following month. 3 lines all typed. No greeting, no signature. Just, I was wrong. About the house. About you. I tucked it into the back of Farley's journal. I didn't need more than that. Thomas called twice. I let it go to voicemail both times. His voice cracked a little near the end of the second message. I didn't erase it, but I didn't call back either. Maybe someday, maybe not. Some wounds don't require confrontation, only distance and silence, and the choice not to bleed again. The museum opened in October. Small crowd, soft light cider, and shortbread cookies in the entry hall. A little girl in a red coat ran her fingers along the old piano keys. Her mother hushed her, but I smiled and shook my head. Let her play. Let her hear what still lives in these rooms. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket over my knees. The gate clicked once. A raccoon shuffled across the gravel. The wind stirred the rosemary again. I breathed it in and let the quiet settle around me. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always arrive with thunder or applause. Sometimes it walks in quietly through the front door you refuse to sell and sits beside you like an old friend. If you're still here, thank you for listening. And if this story reminds you of someone or something you had to protect, even when no one else saw the value in it, I hope you'll share it. Someone out there might need the reminder. Until next time, take good care of yourself.